Hey folks, in this episode of Social Concepts we'll be using some points we've already brought up in other contexts, and then opening up for a question. Our subject is interpersonal relationships in the biblical world, and you won't be surprised to learn that they had quite a different view of them than we do. But you may be surprised to learn just how different. Let's lay it out in terms of three main principles. These days, the idea of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours is sometimes looked upon as a bad thing. But in the social world of the Bible, it was the way they survived. Many interpersonal relationships were conducted in a sort of contractual format. In our vid, The Atonement Contextualized, we discussed the leading form of this relationship in the New Testament era, the interactions of client, patron, and broker. In the Old Testament era, there were similar arrangements, although different terms are used. They could differ on the details, but the basic setup and the principle of mutual reciprocity remained the same. In our modern society, we're used to the idea of building deep personal relationships. But in the social world of the Bible, that happened only very rarely. That's because in their world there was a constant competition between people for personal status and honor. And if you let someone get to know you too well, it would be all too easy for them to take advantage of it. We've already discussed one corollary of this in other vids. Marriages were arranged rather than being based on romantic love, which if it developed at all came after the marriage. But here's another one that's even more important. When certain people make arguments that we can't criticize anyone until we really get to know them, they're way off base. If that's true, then no one could have criticized anyone until maybe the mid-19th century, when individualism became more prominent, and it would have been impossible for anyone to criticize anyone else in the biblical world. And there's another thing. People like this guy talk about showing others that Christianity is true by living their life a certain way. No. I'll say more about that in a future vid. But for now, note that in the evangelistic sermons in Acts, their focus is on the facts as the reason people should believe. The miracles Jesus performed, the Old Testament prophecies he fulfilled, and that he rose from the dead. Relational evangelism? That's not meant to be our lead tactic. Sorry. Even today we recognize a distinction between public and private life, but in the biblical world, that distinction existed on steroids. In some cases it was widely accepted for people to act differently, or even inconsistently, in their public and private lives. That's a good measure because, as we've already said, it was a society where people were competing constantly for honor, and so you had to put a sort of mask on to survive. The New Testament doesn't endorse extremities of this. Here, the book of James advises against the very common practice of not saying what you mean, which was a tactic a lot of people used back then to preserve harmony and peace and to stay out of trouble. Still, the dichotomy between public and private remained intact in general, if not in particulars. In this regard, misinformed commentators like this guy are hard-pressed to explain Jesus' teachings on forgiveness and love with his actions attacking opponents, to say nothing of certain actions of God in the Old Testament. The simple solution to this conundrum is recognizing the distinction between public and private spheres of life. Or put another way, recognizing the distinction between relationships on a personal level and relationships on what might be called an administrative level. Here's an analogy that may be helpful. Take Jesus' teaching on forgiveness. Well, if some guy came and beat you up and took your wallet, Jesus' teaching on forgiveness means that you personally forgive him. What it doesn't mean, though, is that you don't call the police and make him pay for his crime in a legal sense. You forgive the guy on a private level, but on a public level you can still call the law down on him. Okay, now we'll close with a question. Go ahead.
Is it wrong to be friends with atheists? Is it wrong to be married to an atheist?
Good question. The verse most people have in mind here would be this one. Now, in light of what we've said, it's pretty clear that yoking represents something pretty serious, some sort of contractual relationship like patronage. So it doesn't have any application to modern friendships which aren't contractual. So yeah, there's no problem with Christians and atheists being friends. The only place where this teaching would have some relevance is in, say, a marriage relationship. In that case, you'd best think twice before taking the plunge. In close, I'd like to offer a few select comparisons from an appendix in this book, Portraits of Paul by Pilch and Molina, where they compare the two types of societies, the biblical society and modern society. I think they do a great job of explaining it, and I sure can improve on it. See you next time.